and let's put some throttle on, and as you can see it's in limpo. It's not going to rev any further than that, and it's actually only firing on 6 cylinders. Welcome to Bamfordrose, and it's question of the week time. Now in this week's question of the week we look at 2 heritage Astons, the DB7 and the classic Vanquish. Now on DB7 this week I was asked what are the fixed maintenance and running costs. On classic Vanquish we had 2 in this week, one for a pre-purchase inspection that was harbouring quite a few issues, and the other in for a fix that if this car didn't get repaired, you could quite easily see this being put into the marketplace, hoping that it could be sold to some poor unsuspecting soul and it then becomes their problem. So before we get into that question of the week, just feast your eyes on these 2 beauties, because in the DB7 world and the Vanquish world it doesn't get much better than these 2 cars here. Now look at this gorgeous DB7, beautiful Royal Navy blue with a biscuit interior. Now this interior is absolutely in mint condition, and this is what I love about classic cars, when the interiors are brand new, almost as if they came off the production line, yet the car in this case is 24 years old. That just gives you a nice luxury feel on a classic car. Now if the interior is getting a bit tired, that's when I start to fall out of love with a car. For me it has to be perfect. You have to sit in the seat and luxuriate in the inside. That's one of the characteristics of Aston ownership. Bodywork on this car is really smart as well. It's had a little bit of paint repair. You know, you're not going to find a DB7 at this sort of age that doesn't start bubbling some body panels, but if you keep on top of maintenance, and the paint can look really sharp like this car does too. Now as the cars get older, perhaps if it's really low mileage and it's been tucked away somewhere, then it's not going to suffer this problem. But if it's been used across maybe a few winters, certainly now spanning 20 odd years, then corrosion is going to start to bite and there's no real escape from that. So on DB7 we're sort of worried about the front bonnet area where the hinge is mounted. They can corrode quite badly. We're interested in the inner wings, the chassis rails, the floor pan itself, rear subframe and front subframe. Starting to see front subframes where they're corroding quite badly around where the engine mounts are, and that needs to be reworked. We're looking at suspension bushing, steering rack bushing into the subframe, upper and lower wishbone arm bushing. On the rear end we're looking at trailing arms. The drive shafts can suffer with a bit of play, especially if when it's been serviced they've neglected to attack the car with a grease gun. The corrosion is going to start to eat its way into the suspension damper springs. It's super common to have to do a rear subframe resto and 6 damper springs, because you've got 2 dampers either side on the rear and 2 at the front. A load of steel underside, sort of body fixings, brackets, anything steel basically needs powder coating. Generally speaking, on a DB7, the manual gearbox and certainly the ZF 5-speed is pretty bomb-proof. Maybe just on the auto you need to do a range sensor or other position speed sensors, but mechanically the gearboxes are very reliable. And same with the engine. You know, they don't suffer the catalyst ingestion problems that the DB9s do, and it's rare to see a DB7 with a tick. So you know, they don't fail head gaskets, and generally speaking the tappet hydraulic adjusters, lash adjusters, finger followers, that's all pretty bomb proof. What they do suffer with is perishing, deterioration of the vacuum system pipework around the engine. So this is the breather circuit and the vacuum circuit that will give a feed to fuel rails and stuff like that. that can all start cracking, perishing quite badly, and then you get the engine sucking in unmetered air. It runs lean, and that's when the engine starts to run a bit lumpy. Heater blower motors are a common failure on DB7. They start to fail the bearing in the blower motor itself, and then the sort of vanes of the internal heater starts to clatter the outside of the body, and when you turn a heater on, it can sound like a cement mixer until the point it seizes up. It's quite an awkward job because it's sort of a dash out job to do that. You can pick up some Jaguar reconditioned blower motors, but there's no escaping the amount of labour it takes to fix that problem. And then air conditioning itself, integrity of pipes, seal of the compressor, condenser. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's an Aston Martin or a 25-year-old Ford, the pipe work and air conditioning components are going to degrade on any car, and the Aston is no exception. And then you've got normal old car stuff, which again is going to affect any car. Engine coolant radiators leaking, steering rack seals leaking, power steering pipe work leaking, the car locking, window actuators, door actuators. Now that quick run through of jobs there is quite a list, and if you come across a car that needed all of that doing because it sort of needs a comprehensive resto, then that car is probably best parted company with, because parting it out for spares would be the best sort of route for that car. If you were looking at a repair bill or restoration bill, and you've got a garage to do that with purchase price, you'd be better off just to look at the best DB7 on the marketplace to start with and buy that. Now, DB7 being what it is, there are a lot of those older cars that are quite distressed that are in the marketplace, and they're sort of dragging down the price, I think, and name of the really, really good DB7s. If you get a DB7 that needs a lot of the work that I just spoke about needing doing, then it really is a bit of a basket case. It would be for the at-home DIYer where they bought the car cheap and the sort of restoration was a labour of love. It didn't matter how much time that went into it. Obviously they're not going to pay for any labour, and then it sort of does make sense, because if you had to pay to have any of that work done commercially, then it really won't make any sense. And because of that high cost to repair and restore the cars, that's why you see quite a lot of them being quite distressed, being sold for very, very little money. And that really does sort of tarnish the very, very good cars like this blue one here. Now, it's not going to get any much better than this. This DB7 is a joy to sit in. I take this down the road for a drive and it's really, really pleasant. Okay, its driving dynamics are literally of last century. It is more or less the architecture of a Jag XJS underneath. But I think people that buy these cars, that doesn't matter. You just get yourself up to 60, waft along some bends, which it can quite happily do, and that's all the car needs to do. If you do put your foot down, that V12 engine has got some punch to it in a straight line. It will propel you very quickly. So, you know, just because its driving dynamics aren't as good as the later cars, it sort of doesn't matter. And when you're in the seat of this blue car, and the interior just makes you feel so special, and it is classic and understated looks, that ownership experience of that DB7 is really, really nice and worth it. The key message here is pre-purchase inspection, because all the things that I just reeled off very quickly, if you checked at pre-purchase, the car that you're interested in doesn't suffer with any of those, then if you had a very good car to start with, good maintenance history, and you were going to do something like 2,000, 3,000 miles a year, you can pretty much chart your maintenance cost yearly. You know, you're going to have some servicing, you're going to have some brakes and tyres spread across a few years, and you could probably say that ownership could be averaged out, not including insurance and tax and other costs, but certainly maintenance and vehicle related costs, at something like £2,000 a year. You're going to get the odd repair that you need to do, and some years will be more expensive and some will be cheaper, but it is classic car ownership. And unlike the question that I was asked, where it was searching for sort of a fixed cost of what it takes to keep one of these on the road, it really shouldn't be looked at like that. It's a classic car. It's going to chart its own course in terms of parts and repairs that it's going to need, and that is very much part of ownership. Now, if you don't like the sound of that sort of open-ended repair bill, then classic car DB7 sort of not really the car for you. Now let's move on to this Vanquish. Now, what an absolute brute in a suit this one is. Absolutely beautiful colour, absolutely beautiful interior. Sit inside this car and you know you're in somewhere special. Now, when we said that the DB7 driving dynamics of last century, if you sit in this Vanquish, take it down the road, you know you're in a muscle car even when you're tootling along. And then when you do open it up in a straight line, it has got some urgency to it, it has got some punch. In a straight line, it's quite an exciting drive. Now, Vanquish has got all of that character going for it. It's got the aura, the looks like no other Vanquish, no other Aston has got. It's Aston's last hand-built car. It's one of the best Bond cars. So this car has got absolutely everything going for it. But they can be divas in the workshop. They can be quite difficult to keep on the road. And I think the market sort of realises that, and you get a lot of cautious buyers, and the prices are languishing at the moment. Now, if you look at a couple of car auctions that I keep an eye on, there's been a string of non-S that have struggled to sell for 35. Now, this blue one's up at 45, the owner tells me, and I'd be really interested in this car myself. But one rule I have about buying any car or motorbike for myself is that if something catastrophic does go wrong, I can at least fix my way out of trouble. Now, there's been lots of talk on Aston Martin Owners Club forums and sort of Vanquish owners about an ECU problem which the Vanquish can suffer with. Now, I've got a Vanquish in at the moment that's got exactly this problem. The fly-by-wire throttle pedal system and the electronic actuation side, the throttle body, these are two systems that are diagnosed to death for plausibility, so that basically the car can't accelerate when there's been no requested demand from the pedal. Now, what happens is the throttle driver chips and diagnostic chips within the ECU are quite sensitive. They fail. The throttle diagnostic doesn't run. The engine ECU then goes into limp home, and obviously there's a problem that needs fixing. Now, the board and the chips on those Astons, like many cars out of that sort of mid-late 90s era, are very unique, very special. Chips are obsolete, and even ECU repairers struggle to find replacement chips and repair these problems. Now, it's not beyond the wit of engineering to engineer a bespoke solution, which I believe Work Service has looked at. But when a replacement ECU was sort of costed, that whole project of acquiring parts, testing, validation, making, and then looking at how much that costed as an engineering activity. Now, when I was back at the factory, this would be something that I looked at, and you can immediately say this is a £500,000 project. Now, how many ECUs are you going to sell, and at what price do you have to sell them at to even break even? And it just means a value that is completely unworkable, unfeasible, because you'll be looking a pair of ECUs cost the market value of a car for the factory to recover any sort of money. So it's not going to happen. Now, it's quite difficult in aftermarket to put a replacement ECU in. The ECU controls aircon, traction control, car security. So there's a lot of features that an aftermarket ECU would have to be able to deliver, which in reality are not going to. So you would have to hardwire some of these solutions in, a separate sort of aircon switch or something like that, separate bit of security and traction control that was different to the factory one. Then all of a sudden the car starts to feel a little bit modified instead of like a seamless ECU replacement, and when you've spent a lot of money on that, to have something that wasn't seamlessly integrated and felt a bit aftermarket is probably not something your Vanquish sort of owner wants. So it's a bit of a conundrum, really. There's no real viable solution in aftermarket to put in that's cost effective, but for a factory solution, let's say they came up with an ECU, that is an investment that I'm led to believe, could be corrected, that they don't want to make. They've got bigger fish to fry. So Vanquish is sort of thrown under a bus, really, when it comes to its ECU. Now I say thrown under a bus because what I've got to do on this channel is highlight the realities of ownership of these cars. So when somebody phones me up and says they've just bought a Vanquish and it's got an OBD light on and it's not revving too well, they bring the car into me, immediately I can see that it's only firing on 6 cylinders because it's in limp home. It won't reset, it is an ECU error. Then if they've bought that car for £80,000, maybe the way they bought it, auction or whatever it was, they had no comeback, then they have an £80,000 paperweight. And no matter the people that would get upset when you talk about the realities of ownership, then I have to put videos out that can make people aware of this, so that some poor unsuspecting soul doesn't spend £80,000 of their life savings to end up with a car that will not function. Now, if I put a video out that does explain the realities of ownership, then people can make choices eyes wide open whether this is a path that they wish to go down. Now, some Vanquish ECUs have been repaired. We've been able to repair some problems on throttle drivers, coil drivers, injector drivers. These have been able to be repaired. Now I've got a car here which I'll show you in a minute, which has got quite a fundamental problem that will need a complete new chip, and I very much doubt this is going to be able to be repaired. Now I say people get upset when this sort of problem is highlighted, and sort of Vanquish has been thrown under a bus a little bit, because if you take one of the Vanquish Ultimate that is being sold at £150,000, at the turn of an ignition key, the car can turn into a paperweight. Now we'll go and sit in the driver's seat of this car and I can show you the problem that it has. Now what would happen is you key on from cold, the diagnostics run, they fail, it goes into limp home. And the car is in limp home, it won't rev above 3,500 RPM. You could get it warm, you could cycle the ignition a few times, and basically this diagnostic now doesn't run because the car is too warm. And hey presto, the car functions fine. What will happen is cars like this will have this problem masked. They'll end up at an auction somewhere and someone will buy it like this. And hopefully if they do buy a car with this problem, they've got some comeback. But if there's no comeback, then this is a problem that at the moment is going to be a struggle to be fixed. Alright, so let's go for a start on this one. Turn the ignition key on, and straight away it's into restricted performance. So we're in neutral now, ready to start. So it's fired up in restricted performance, and that's because of that throttle check and ECU issue. Now, when it's cold and first started, it's going through its series of diagnostic checks, and it will remain in restricted performance mode. And even if you put the laptop on and reset it, it won't come out of that. But if we allow this to warm up, now I'll shortcut this. If you look at the coolant gauge, we're pretty much on minimum because we just started cold. You'll rejoin me in a second and we'll be fully warm. So we're back again, fully warmed up. Now I'm not sure if you can hear from how the engine's running, but this is extremely unhappy. Now the ECU has a problem with its throttle system that is restricting performance. On one side it's also misfiring on a few cylinders, so it's got two ECUs that are upset. Now it's had the problem when it's cold because that's when it's run its diagnostics. And let's put some throttle on, and as you can see it's in limp-home. It's not going to rev any further than that, and it's actually only firing on 6 cylinders. Now what we'll do is turn the ignition off and back on again and see if the system resets. So we've got the OBD light on, the orange check engine light there. So that is remnants of the previous fault that it had. But because it's warm and it's not running its diagnostics anymore, then it hasn't gone into restricted performance mode. Revs up fine. Now there is an issue, as you can see, it's idling at 2000 RPM there. And this is something in the throttle control which is in error. So now we've warmed it up and run it a few times, we've got it to key cycle itself into no restricted performance. No error light on the center dash saying restricted performance. And it's basically running in a fashion where if you weren't super detective, you would never really uncover that this car is harbouring two failed ECUs. Alright, so now we'll give it a couple more key cycles. Now it's fully warm, it's not running that throttle diagnostic. And let's see if those few key cycles I've taken the OBD light off. There you go. So now we've got an engine that's ticking over fine. We've got no OBD light on. We're not in restricted performance. And if the car came into you at this point for a pre-purchase inspection, or you'd bought it from one of those auction sites and it managed to get itself into this position, you could temporarily have a car that exhibits no problems whatsoever, but basically is fundamentally failed because two ECUs are not working. Now the problem we've just seen there with me in the car, I can pick that up at a pre-purchase inspection, but you've got to have the car overnight. You've got to run it cold, you've got to run it warm, you've got to run it up in the workshop, you've got to drive it. Every single Vanquish that is being sold, the owners or the prospective owners need to do a comprehensive pre-purchase inspection. There's some Vanquish out there that are trading at £40,000 that quite literally need £40,000 worth of corrective work to them. Now, like we did for the DB7, let's just quickly rattle through it. Starting at the front end, subframe corrosion. This is a real common one on Vanquish. You know, the cars get washed, water drains down on the subframe channels, doesn't get driven, doesn't get blown off, and then that water causes corrosion. On the front end as well, damper bushes, all steering anti-roll bar drop link arms. You know, these are all MOT failures now if boots and seals are split. So you can quite easily have to do upper arms, lower arms, anti-roll bar drop link arms, damper bushes, subframe resto. Moving towards the back of the car, gearbox system. Now you have to treat this as a whole. Transmission pump, does the ASM pack need refurbishing? magnetic position sensor evolution, new clutch, quite easily burn through £15,000 on a car that flashes its gearbox error light as you try and go through the gears. On the rear end, also subframe restoration. The exhaust system, the intermediate pipes into the silencer, they can often corrode and you need to remake that whole system. It's heat shield socks, again on the rear end, upper wishbone arms, lower wishbone arms, track control arms, all of these suspension components need replacing, often because of split seals. Fuel pumps, very common for especially E10 now to be degrading fuel pumps. But again, all of those problems you could identify at a pre-purchase inspection. Now this blue one has got none of those problems. It's got a clean bill of health, this car. Now really, ownership of this car would just be the risk of that ECU failure, which I think you could protect yourself against. You could avoid jump starting the car when the battery is really flat and the alternator kicks into maximum duty cycle just after it's been started. It's those sorts of spikes which affect the ECU. You can get defender kits out there now which prevent these spikes going back to the ECU. And you could make sure your harness isn't chafed in any of the common wear points that Vanquish sort of suffered with. Now if you go to all those protective measures, then you can safeguard yourself against an ECU failure. But I wouldn't be able to say that the ECU will never fail on a Vanquish. It's something that could happen, and if it does, then there is no replacement out there, and that causes a big problem. Now something that affects DB7 as well as Vanquish is the availability of parts. Now that automakers only have to support the cars until they're 10 years old. It's quite a commitment for an engineering team to resource and stock all the different parts that these cars could need. Now both Vanquish and DB7 have probably got specialist parts made by suppliers that don't exist anymore, so you've got to go and resource a new supplier to make those parts. So it's quite easy, if the factory have got other priorities, to not prioritise the parts for those heritage cars. Now what the factory is then opening the door to is being accused of not supporting their heritage cars in the marketplace. That will lead to values slipping, and ultimately it leads to videos like this that identifies problems like the ECU. Apart from pre-purchase inspection being the message of the day, then if you're really not sort of 100% committed to classic car ownership, sort of if you're only looking at DB7 because the value is low, especially in Vanquish where values are a bit disappointing at the moment, and that was like one of the reasons why you're interested in it, then I would advise looking at one of the more modern Astons. For the same sort of money you could get yourself into a really nice DB9.2, electronic adaptive suspension, carbon ceramic brakes, much more engine power, a much more reliable, predictable ownership journey in terms of maintenance and spend. So you know, if you really weren't committed to the classic car ownership, then I'd advise looking at the newer cars. And in terms of finding workshops to take those cars to, well, you know, naturally they've aged their way out of the franchise dealer network. Take a Vanquish to a franchise dealer and you've struggled to find a technician that was around when the cars first came out. Now really you need people very experienced on Vanquish to be able to work on them. I would say in terms of Vanquish, obviously you've got us, we've got 7 Vanquish on site today, all for major fixing. Nicholas Me, Aston Workshop, Work Service, I think that's it. I mean, everywhere else that is specialised in Aston or a franchise dealer, obviously they can change fluids and filters robustly, that's not in question, not in any doubt. But when it comes to a bit more than that, a fix, then the workshops I've just mentioned are pretty much the only ones that are going to do it robustly. And to come full circle back to the beginning of the video, well, charting classic car ownership in terms of a fixed yearly cost is sort of not possible. To avoid any unpleasantness, have a pre-purchase inspection done, and a proper one, and then maintenance when you own the car, and maintain it to the best that you can, and don't subject it to voltage spikes, and try and keep away that sort of dreaded ECU failure. If you want to chat further about these sorts of technical aspects, then our live stream on Sunday the 25th of February at 10 o'clock in the evening GMT is the place for you. Of course, also the place for you is next instalment of a forum chat or question of the week. And if you like this sort of content, then think about giving us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, give us your comments on classic Vanquish and DB7 ownership.